Hi, my name is Toni Henneman, and I staff the Local Government Interim Committee. During the last interim, the committee chose to study the Entitlement Share program, and this training is a result of the work they completed. Committee members recognize the importance of the Entitlement Share program to both local governments and the state, and moved to consider Entitlement Share training be included in legislator orientation. The training is going to be broken down into 3 parts. This first part will cover the basic premise of the program and its historical background. The second clip is a video from the past interim when the Local Government Interim Committee heard from an expert panel and offered questions and discussion. And lastly, a third video is provided to cover the major changes to the Entitlement Share over time. Additionally, written reports of most topics that will be covered are posted on the website for further research. As mentioned, this first video covers the history of the program. To begin, I want to point out 3 main objectives. First, we'll cover what the program is. Next, we'll cover how did we get here, again talk about the history of the program. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, we'll cover why should I care as a legislator? Why is this program important for legislators who interact with local government entities and those who might not? So we'll try to cover the 2 objectives in one go. We're going to jump back to 2001 and talk about House Bill 124. It's also been known as the Big Bill, and again, it was introduced in 2001, and this is technically the bill that created the Entitlement Share program. And most of the bill was crafted during the 1999 and 2000 interim by the Local Government Funding and Structure Committee. So before we jump into House Bill 124, I want to go back just a little bit further to 1997. In fiscal year 97, almost $300 million in state revenue was collected at the county level. County treasurers needed over 100 lines of code to complete their annual reports, making it a very complicated system. So the combination of the large amount of money and the complicated accounting process created an opportunity for mistakes. So a committee of county treasurers and state agency personnel was formed to make recommendations for improvements. So this committee had multiple findings, but I think this is probably the most significant. They found that breakdowns in communication between state agencies and local governments may have led to improper distributions. I'm going to highlight 2 specific examples here. First, counties were supposed to keep Senate Bill 417 personal property reimbursements, but almost half was actually remitted to the state. Additionally, House Bill 20 personal property reimbursements were incorrectly remitted to the state rather than counties, possibly as far back as 1993. So what this committee found was not only a few red flags starting to show, but also that these problems may have been going on for longer than was first thought. So early in 1998, in April, the Department of Revenue and Legislative Audit formed the County Revenue Collection Work Team, also known as the CRC. This work team did similar work to the prior committee and found 3 final recommendations. 1, try to ensure adequate checks and balances between the money that is remitted to the state, kept by counties, and vice versa. And then also allow for methods of automation whenever possible. And lastly, simplify laws related to county and state revenue collection and dispersal. Now, one of the themes that will become very clear through this whole presentation is simplify. And the next slide will show a flow chart that adequately illustrates why simplicity was important. So this actually is a flowchart of how monies were earmarked, distributed, sent to different places before the Entitlement Share program began. Don't worry about trying to read all this flowchart. There's a lot in here. The main takeaway is just to realize that this was just one type of fee, just illustrating vehicle fees, and the massive amount of different places and chunks of money that had to be sent to different accounts, whether that be the state, special revenue accounts, kept in separate county accounts. It really was a nightmare. And again, just to go back to where we started, this system is so complicated, it's going to probably create errors in revenue dispersal. So keep that flowchart in mind whenever we talk about simplification. So later in 1998, in August, the Department of Revenue also established the Local Government Funding and School Finance Group. Now, there's a lot of alphabet soup there. Suffice it to say that it was mainly built with county, city officials, school personnel, some Department of Justice, and then also Revenue. So a lot of various stakeholders were in with this committee. Now, they did a lot of research, but one of the areas that they really found and focused on was property tax reimbursement programs, and that they have a lot of drawbacks. So to give a little bit of context, it was fairly common for the legislature to cut property taxes. And while that's beneficial for individual citizens, local governments and schools heavily rely on property tax revenue to fund their budgets. So what the state would then do when they would cut property tax was offer reimbursement programs to try and backfill or make whole those local governments and schools. So while the theory sounds great, it was found that there were some drawbacks. One, each reimbursement required unique, often confusing calculations, and they further complicated an already complicated budgeting process for schools and local governments. And then lastly, each time a taxing jurisdiction changed, the reimbursement calculations had to change. Again, further hammering home the idea that things are too complicated, and it just really makes the job of the county treasurers very difficult. It was unwieldy to use these reimbursement programs often. So if we go forward to the vision statement from this committee, and this is a vision statement that will actually carry through with multiple other committees that are going to take this project on. I want to just go ahead and read this because I think it does do a great job of summarizing the main philosophical tenets of the program. It says, "We are dedicated to a partnership among state, county, city, and school districts that is based on mutual trust and respect for local authority. This partnership will enable all governments to respond to the demands of their citizens in the 21st century through a revenue system that is simple, understandable, equitable, stable, and adequate, and through a revenue collections and distribution system that is simple, efficient, accurate, and timely." So again, really emphasizing that we need to simplify things, but then also keep it equitable and accurate. So moving forward to the 1999 legislative session, the legislature again enacted tax cuts, as mentioned earlier. This year, local governments and schools saw a $115.6 million reduction in their property tax revenue. Now, there were two bills that attempted to offset the reductions with reimbursements. However, if we do some simple math and we start with the $115.6 million in revenue loss, subtract the $76 million in reimbursement that was offered, still going to see almost a $40 million deficit, and again, that will be felt by local governments and schools. So the question now becomes, what is the solution for local governments and schools? And most likely, it will be for them to increase their mill levies. So on one hand, this kind of creates a vicious cycle where the legislature cuts property taxes, local governments and schools are left kind of with some backfill needed, so they're going to raise property taxes on their end. So this will also become complicated because Senate Bill 184, while it did provide some reimbursement, it also then will sunset those reimbursements in 2001. So technically that deficit could grow in 2001 if further action was not taken. Another thing that Senate Bill 184 did was created two study committees to kind of look at possibly solving this issue. So the committee that we will spend more time looking at is the Local Government Funding and Structure Committee, also known as the LGFSC. The other committee was the Court Funding and Structure Committee, and while I won't spend much time discussing that, it will kind of come into play later on. So the LGFSC consisted of 2 representatives, 2 senators, 2 county commissioners, the director of DOR, a city manager, a city councilman, and 1 county treasurer. So a pretty wide smattering of experts in the field that could then come together and hopefully make the best program available. The committee early on established 3 goals. Their first one should sound familiar at this point. It was to simplify billing, collection, accounting, distribution, and reporting of all revenue. Second was to try to de-earmark revenue and eliminate expenditure mandates for local government. Again, think back to that very complicated flow chart. That's a great example of how earmarks can be very complicated. And the third was to create a rational, dependable, stable funding structure for cities and counties. Now, most of the work of the LGFSC was completed in 2000, and I want to go ahead and share one quick quote from their final report, because again, it does help kind of encapsulate their ideas. It reads, "All governments and citizens deserve a revenue system that produces adequate and relatively constant revenue, treats individuals and businesses fairly, is easy for taxpayers to understand, minimizes administrative costs, and has all economic activity and wealth contributing proportionally to support government service." So by the end of 2000, the LGFSC had multiple recommendations. First, it was to provide a single set of uniform budget laws for local governments. Second was to establish guidelines for earmarking revenue and develop a system to review earmarked funds. And that also kind of piggybacks on the idea of we have to get rid of earmarks. And if we are going to leave some earmarks, let's make sure that we have a system to check them and make sure they are working as intended. And also to change the flow of revenue so that most revenue remains with the government that collects it. And the main goal here is to streamline the process. There also was discussion of transferring the welfare and district court funding responsibilities to the state. And lastly, they recommended creating general fund entitlement shares to replace lost revenue from property tax reductions and streamlined fee collection. These shares would utilize an annual growth rate. Now here I want to make it very clear that the Entitlement Share program, right off the get-go, was developed for two main reasons. One was to replace that lost revenue from property tax reductions, and then second was to enable a vehicle for the streamlining of revenue collection. And this last quote from the LGFSC final report kind of summarizes the challenges and identifies right at the beginning that trust may be an issue. So the second sentence I will read, the legislature will have less control over local government, and local government will have the right to receive an entitlement share of the general fund without specific revenue or expenditure requirements. Building this trust level will be a challenge. So again, in order for this program to work, the state has to allow local governments more flexibility, and local governments then might have to adhere to stricter audit requirements. And that is very, very well stated through the rest of the report as well, that it's going to be a balance between the state allowing more freedom and then the local governments being willing to take on more stringent audit requirements as well. So the final product of the LGFSC was House Bill 124. And House Bill 124 received its first hearing in the House Local Government Committee on January 25th of 2001. That hearing lasted 3 hours with 21 proponents and 20 opponents testifying. Since it was such a large undertaking and seemed to be one that was going to take quite a while, the legislative leadership assigned House Bill 124 to the Local Government Funding Select Committee. Now, this committee met multiple times, and I have the meetings kind of designated in this table. I won't go through all of the meetings, but hopefully you can see that they did meet multiple times. They had a lot of different stakeholders come in and discuss. And one thing I think is most interesting is the number of amendments that were proposed. There were a lot of them. Quite a few amendments were also adopted. So this committee, the Select Committee, did a lot of work, and a lot of that work was done after their regular hearings and regular floor and Senate sessions. So when it was all said and done, 14 hours was the total time that the Local Government Select Committee spent listening to testimony and workshopping House Bill 124. It was quite a large undertaking for them. So moving forward, once the bill comes out of that Funding Select Committee, I'll quickly kind of run through the process that it goes through. Again, it hit the House Local Government, passed there. The House passed it fairly strongly. It was sent over to the Senate, where it passed out of Senate tax. And then the Senate amends the bill on the floor. The House does not concur with those amendments, which then puts it into a free conference committee. That report is eventually adopted. And then the governor, though, also proposes amendments, which are eventually finally adopted. And I like to mention this just because I think that if there is a process that can happen on a bill, it happened to 124. It got a select committee, it had a free conference committee, there were governor's amendments added. So it did have a lot of time and a lot of discussion and a lot of workshopping. So finally, the governor signed House Bill 124 into law on May 5th of 2001, marking the culmination of roughly 4 years of various committee work and making the Entitlement Share program an important fixture of local government finance. And mostly, the program has stayed fairly consistently the way that it was built in 2001. And now coming into the 21 session, this is the 20-year anniversary of the program. And while there have been a few significant changes to the program, which I will cover in video 3, again, the program still functions primarily in the same way that it was intended. So if we can go back a little bit, this is the last time I'm going to show this awful flow chart to just remind ourselves this is one of the purposes of the program was, again, to streamline this and de-earmark and make this more simple for the local governments. And what happened after House Bill 124 is illustrated here. So it's much more streamlined. The local governments collect the fees, and then they send them on to the state and they will be held in the general fund. Now, the state then is going to send each local government back an entitlement share, because that money that the county collected and remitted to the state technically were fees that were always held by the county or the cities. And that's why the program was called Entitlement Share. And I think that could use some explanation. It is Entitlement Share because those are fees that the local governments were entitled to. And that was the idea. They remitted them all to the state to make it more simple, but then always with the understanding that they would then still receive a part of those fees as they had done in the past. So the last two slides I'm going to show are some graphs from Sam Schaefer with the Legislative Fiscal Division that just kind of shows how this program has possibly progressed over time. So this first graph shows the revenues assumed by the state as a result of House Bill 124. Now, if we look at the key, the green, again, are those vehicle taxes and fees that were just sent from the counties to the state. Orange is gambling taxes and fees, gray alcohol taxes, and then the district court fees in red. Again, those are fees that go directly to the state and are kept in the general fund in return for an entitlement share. This next graph shows the historical expenditures associated with House Bill 124 and other costs that affect entitlement share payments. So the orange are costs related to House Bill 124 directly. The red, we have some district court costs that were transferred to the Office of Public Defender at the state level. Blue, additional OPD costs. And then the pink, Senate Bills 372 and 96. Those are actually two bills that enacted business equipment tax cuts. And so again, the Entitlement Share program is used to streamline the revenue process, but it also is a vehicle for the state to then offer tax cut reimbursements to local governments. And that's what you see in the pink there. Now this last graph will just overlay the prior two. So that green line shows the revenues that the state has been assuming since House Bill 124 was enacted in 2001, and then it shows how those expenditures have grown as well. So while I understand that this is a high-level overview, it is a complicated program that can take a lot more discussion. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can call me at 444-3593 or go to the email on the screen there. And again, I'll remind you that there are additional written resources available on the website, and I would definitely push anyone who is interested to check those out as well, as they will go into more depth than what I've provided today. Now, if you're finished watching this video, please go ahead and check out the next two videos, again, because they will give you further depth and explanation of changes to the program. Thank you.